Hello, I'm Wendy Walker, and welcome to my South African transition from apartheid to democracy. This presentation follows South Africa from the National Party victory in 1948 to the adoption of the democratic constitution in 1996. The key point is that the transition was not a sudden gift from political elites. Apartheid first used parliamentary authority to make racial hierarchy legal, but organized resistance gradually made the system harder to defend, administer, and finance. Early civil disobedience, the Freedom Charter, anti-pass campaigns, student protests, labor organizing, church activism, community movements, international sanctions, and negotiations each added a different kind of pressure. Together, they pushed the state from radical exclusion towards universal citizenship and constitutional limits on government power. Before the transition, South Africa had the outward form of parliamentary government, but the political community was racially restricted. The National Party used its 1948 electoral victory to expand existing segregation into apartheid, a system that organized law, land, education, movement, and labor around racial classifications. Because Parliament was treated as sovereign, courts had limited ability to stop discriminatory legislation. The key sociological issue is that the state claimed legal authority while denying full membership to most people living under its rule. That contradiction helped explain why resistance movement framed apartheid not only as bad policy, but as an illegitimate form of government. Apartheid operated through ordinary institutions, which made it more durable than a single discriminatory statute. Racial classifications determined where a person could live, which school a child could attend, what job was realistically available, to whether travel required documents. These controls concentrated power in white institutions while making non-white life administratively dependent on the state. Forced removals and homeland policies also divided communities and tried to separate political claims from national citizenship. These conditions generally resistant because they were experienced every day in homes and classrooms, workplaces, transportation, and encounters with police. Social movements therefore grew from both political exclusions and routine social humiliation. Early resistance mattered because it gave apartheid opponents organizational habits and a democratic vocabulary. The Defiance Campaign asked volunteers to violate selected apartheid laws openly and non-violently, turning obedience itself into a political question. The Freedom Charter then moved beyond protest against particular law in imagining a South Africa in which the people as a whole would govern. The ANC, the PAC, Indian Congresses, and colored organizations and other allies did not agree. But their campaigns showed that apartheid faced organized opposition across racial community lines. This movement also revealed that state dependency on punishment because peaceful challenges were often answered with arrest and bans. Sharp was a turning point because the state answered an anti-pass protest with lethal force and then intensified repression. Lodge treated the massacre as both a local event and a national rupture. It exposed the corrosion foundation of apartheid to South Africans and to the wide world. Afterward, the ANC and PAC were banned, which meant lawful opposition became even more constrained. Some activists concluded that nonviolent protests alone could not challenge a government willing to criminalize organizations and shoot demonstrators. The formation of Umaka Wizi and the Riverton trial did not replace mass politics, but they internationalized the struggle and made imprisoned leaders symbols of democratic resistance. The Soweto uprising showed how social movements could grow from institutions that seemed ordinary, such as schools. Students protested that state efforts to impose Afrikanese as a language of instruction in black schools, but their grievances pointed to the larger structure of Bantu education. Apartheid schooling prepared black youth for subordinate social positions, so student activism challenged both classroom policy and that of state racial futures. Police violence against young demonstrators produced outrage inside South Africa and abroad. It also helped politicalize a new generation of many of whom joined community groups, underground networks, or exiled organizations. In this sense, Soweto linked youth activism to the broader movement across apartheid governments. By the late apartheid period, resistance was no longer located only in national political organizations. Trade unions could disrupt production and bargain over workplace power, which made labor a political force even when activists spoke in economy language. Churches and religious leaders, including figures such as Diamond Tutu, challenged apartheid as a moral and human rights crisis. Community organizations addressed rent, transportation, schools, removal, and local services, turning everyday grievances into collective pressure. These movements mattered because they were embedded in the places the state needed to govern. They also made repression more difficult. Banning one organization could not easily silence workers, congregations, students, and neighborhood communities acting at the same time. International advocacy expanded the scale of the anti-apartheid struggle. Exiled organizations, churches, student groups, trade unions, and anti-apartheid committees pressured governments in universities, in artists, and sport bodies to stop treating apartheid South Africans as normal. Sanctions and divestments did not single-handedly end apartheid, but they weakened the regime room for the maneuver. They raised the economic cost of repression, made diplomatic isolation visible, and reinforced the claim that apartheid lacked legitimacy. This mattered because domestic movements were facing a powerful security state. Internal pressure helped make negotiations more attractive to parts of the ruled establishment, while South African activists kept the internal crisis alive. Mandela's release in February of 1990 did not mean apartheid had already ended, but it did mark a major change in strategy. The government unbanded political organizations and began negotiating with its leaders it had previously imprisoned, exiled, or criminalized. This turn reflected pressure from many directions: domestic protests, labor unrest, community resistance, armed struggles. It produced long-term legitimacies. Negotiations were difficult and violence continued, so the transition should not be romanticized as a simple coming together story. Still, talks were essential because they translated movements pressured into electoral rules, constitutional principles, and new institutions that could replace white minority rules. The 1994 election was the institutional breakthrough that apartheid had denied for decades. National political membership from all adult citizens. Its importance was not simply that the ANC won and Mandela became president, although those were historical outcomes. The deeper challenge was that authority no longer rested on a racial restricted election. Voting lines symbolized a new political community in which people who had been classified, moved, policed, and excluded could participate in choosing the government. Social movement helped make it possible to keep pressure on the state until the negotiated election became the route out of the crisis. The vote transformed protest claims into democratic legitimacy. The 1996 Constitution completed the governmental transition by making equality rights and constitutional supremacy central to the new state. Under apartheid, a parliament could create and enforce racial hierarchy with limited constitutional restraint. Under the new system, political power was subject to a supreme constitution, an enforceable Bill of Rights, universal suffrage, multi-party democracy, and judicial review. This compared is important because the transition was not only a change from one ruling party to another, it reconstructed the relationship between citizen and state. Social movements had demanded equal citizenship for decades, and the Constitution turned that demand into legal framework for democratic government. So in conclusion, South Africa's transition showed why social movements matter in governmental change. Apartheid did not disappear because one event leader or organized defeated it alone. Peaceful protests challenged legality. Civil disobedience made unjust laws visible. Student activism exposed the crisis of apartheid in education. Labor strikes threatened production. Churches and community groups were widened in participation. Armed resistance showed the limits of repression, and international boycotts and sanctions raised external costs. Negotiations were necessary, but they occurred in a context created by collective action. This democratic state that emerged in 1994 and 1996 was therefore a political reconstruction movement, helped transform excluded subjects into citizens with rights, votes, and constitutional protection. Thank you. Again, my name is Wendy Walker, and I hope you've enjoyed my presentation today.